In the suffocating heat of July 1518, a lone woman stepped into a narrow, empty street. Her name was Frau Trophäa. Her expression was blank, her eyes unfocused, seeing something far beyond the half-timbered houses that leaned over her. She began to move. It was not a dance of joy, but a silent, jerky convulsion that seemed to possess her from within. Her movements had no rhythm. They were the spasms of a body at war with itself. For hours, she continued under the harsh sun, her limbs jerking in a disturbing pantomime of celebration. The empty street was her stage, a silent witness to a private torment that was about to become a very public curse. This unnatural scene unfolded in the city of Strasbourg. In 1518, this city was a vessel of profound misery, a place already on the edge of collapse. A series of bad harvests had led to widespread famine, and the faces of its citizens were hollowed out by starvation and poverty. The air itself felt sick, thick with a deep religious dread. Diseases like syphilis and leprosy stalked the alleyways, and death was a constant, familiar neighbor. Strasbourg was a city primed for a curse, a community where superstition was a more potent force than medicine, and where the people felt abandoned by both God and man. We return to Frau Trophäa, who has now been moving for 6 days. She does not eat, she does not rest. Her feet are torn and bloody, her body withered to a skeletal frame, but the agonizing motion does not stop. She is a prisoner inside her own skin. Then the true horror began. One by one, her neighbors stepped from their homes to join her. Their eyes held the same vacant stare. Their bodies began the same spasmodic, agonizing jerks. It was not a shared moment of madness. It was a contagion. Within a week, more than 30 people were caught in this unstoppable plague of motion. By the end of the month, the number had swollen to 400. They were not people dancing. They were puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen and malevolent force that had taken root in the desperate heart of the city. The city's authorities were baffled and terrified. Physicians and civic leaders observed the victims and arrived at a chilling diagnosis. They concluded the phenomenon was a natural disease caused by an imbalance of what they called hot blood. Their prescribed cure was not rest, but more dancing. Their logic was a terrifying product of their time. The victims had to dance the fever out of their systems. And so, the city's leaders made a fatal decision. They ordered a large wooden stage to be built in the grain market and even hired musicians, hoping to help the afflicted dance the poison away. The scene at the public stage was a vision of hell. Hundreds of people writhed in the open air, their faces contorted in agony, their clothes soaked with sweat and blood. The sound was not of music, but of shuffling, bleeding feet on wooden planks, mixed with the desperate prayers and agonized screams of those who could not stop. The horror became a public spectacle. In the town square, under the summer sun, hundreds of bodies moved without rest. The sounds were of shuffling, scraping feet on cobblestone, of ragged, desperate breaths. Bones cracked, muscles tore, feet stripped of their shoes bled onto the stones, polishing them a dull, grim red. Strasbourg was no longer a city. It had become a theater for a slow, agonizing, and very public execution. And the faces of the dancers held no joy. Their expressions were masks of torment, their bodies slick with sweat, their lips cracked and dry. They were not celebrating. They were prisoners in a war against their own limbs. They wept as they danced. They pleaded for it to stop, even as their legs continued the relentless, terrible rhythm. The musicians, hired to cure them, played on, their melodies becoming the soundtrack to a city's descent into madness. But the historical records, for all their detail on the physical exhaustion, hint at something far more sinister. They were not merely tired. Witnesses claimed the dancers' eyes were filled with a terror that was not of this world. They looked past the crowds, past the buildings, as if staring into an abyss that only they could see. What haunted them was not just the endless motion. It was what they saw in the spaces between heartbeats. This was the chilling question left unanswered in the city's chronicles. Was their frantic movement an attempt to flee from some unseen horror? Were they puppets, their muscles and bones pulled by invisible strings, forced to perform for a silent, malevolent audience? The terror in their eyes was not the fear of death by exhaustion. It was the fear of a soul already claimed. The city's misguided cure had become a catastrophe. The death toll mounted with terrifying speed. As many as 15 people per day collapsed in the streets, their hearts finally giving out from the strain. The stages built for healing became platforms for death. The music intended to soothe had only fed the plague, strengthening its hold on the city. The cure was the poison. Realizing their catastrophic error, the city's leaders reversed their course. In a panic, they banned all music, all public gatherings. The stages were torn down. The musicians were sent away. Desperate, they turned from the physical world to the spiritual. They began to take the remaining afflicted to a shrine high in the mountains, a place dedicated to Saint Vitus, a figure they prayed could break this unholy spell. Modern science has tried to file this horror away into neat, rational boxes. The most common explanation is mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria. But this theory crumbles under the weight of reality. Hysteria does not grant a person the superhuman endurance to dance for weeks on end. It does not explain how hundreds of people, many of whom were strangers, fell into the same complex, unending motion. Another theory points to ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye grain. Ergot poisoning can cause muscle spasms and hallucinations. Yet it cannot explain the coordinated, rhythmic dancing seen in Strasbourg. The victims of ergotism writhe in agony. They do not dance. The symptoms simply do not match. The rational explanations are a comfort, but they are not the truth. So we must look past the veil of the known world. This was not a plague of the body or a sickness of the mind. It was an attack on the soul, a meticulously executed curse awakened by a city's desperation. And the very name they called upon for salvation, Saint Vitus, holds the dark secret to the curse's origin. For what if Vitus was never a saint? History is filled with old gods, pagan deities whose names and rituals were absorbed and reshaped by the church. What if Vitus was one of these, an ancient spirit of wild, ecstatic, and dangerous revelry? By building stages, hiring musicians, and forcing the afflicted to dance. The people of Strasbourg were not performing a cure. They had accidentally completed a forgotten ritual, inviting a hungry, ancient power to a festival held in its honor. The curse was a living thing. It was born from a whispered prayer of vengeance, a dark bargain struck in a forgotten corner of Strasbourg by those the city had wronged. This was not a sickness of the mind. It was a weapon, carefully aimed at the heart of the community, designed to turn the city's own structures against its people. The plague sought not just to kill, but to make a terrifying public show of its power. It was an infection that fed on attention. The curse was designed to grow stronger with every terrified stare, every panicked prayer. It needed an audience. It needed a stage. The more the city officials tried to understand and control it, the more they played into its hands, building the very theater the malevolence required to reach its full, horrifying power. And so, the city leaders completed the ritual they never knew they were performing. The curse required a public stage, and they provided the guild halls and the open market square. It required continuous, hypnotic sound, and they hired musicians to play night and day. Most importantly, it required an audience of the fearful, and the entire city of Strasbourg watched, their terror feeding the very horror they witnessed. They thought they were offering a cure. Instead, they were building an altar. Every note played by the hired minstrels, every coin spent on the public stages, was an offering to the unseen force. The city, in its desperate attempt to heal, was unwittingly orchestrating a massive, months-long occult ceremony, empowering the curse beyond its creator's darkest dreams. Then, in early September, it ended. The dancing did not fade because of a cure or a successful intervention. It simply stopped. The music fell silent. The exhausted survivors collapsed, their bodies broken, but their minds suddenly their own. The curse seemed to lift from Strasbourg as mysteriously as it had arrived. This lack of a clear ending is perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire phenomenon. A disease is cured. A famine ends when food arrives. But this plague, it felt sated. It was as if a great, unseen predator had finished its meal and simply moved on, leaving the city in a state of shocked, traumatized silence. In the aftermath, a new kind of silence fell. For centuries, the dancing plague of 1518 became a strange piece of local trivia, a dark story whispered but rarely examined. Historical records were altered. Some were buried entirely. This was not a city forgetting a tragedy. It was a city actively trying to erase a memory too terrible to hold. The fear was the reason. How do you document an event that defies reason? To write it down was to give it power, to admit that the world was not as orderly as they believed. The silence in the archives is its own form of evidence. It is the sound of a community so profoundly terrified that it chose to cut out a part of its own history, hoping to kill the ghost by erasing its name. We believe our modern world is safe from such things, protected by science and reason. We stand on pavement and concrete, convinced that the dark soil of the past cannot reach us. But the story of Strasbourg is a chilling reminder that history is not a collection of facts safely stored in books. It is a living layer of energy, of dormant curses and unsettled scores resting just beneath our feet. The ghosts of then are not gone. They are merely sleeping. What if the dancing plague was not a sickness of the body or mind, but a sickness of the soul, invited into Strasbourg by some forgotten sin? Curses in the old world were not simple words of anger. They were seen as living things, parasites of spiritual energy that attach themselves to a place or a bloodline, waiting for a moment of weakness to feed. This malevolent force, once given a foothold, does not need a reason to spread. It simply follows the paths of human connection, moving from one person to the next, not through touch or breath, but through shared fear. The terror in one person's eyes becomes the doorway into the next person's heart. The curse of 1518 did not infect bodies, it consumed spirits. Imagine the horror of realizing the cure is the disease. The city officials, in their desperation, brought musicians and built stages, thinking more dancing would tire the curse out. Instead, they built it a temple. They fed the dark energy with music and public spectacle, turning a hidden ritual into a citywide sacrifice. Each note played was another prayer to the darkness. Each new dancer who joined the throng was another soul offered up. The city of Strasbourg, trying to heal itself, accidentally completed the curse's final, terrible ritual. They were not fighting a plague. They were participating in a ceremony they did not understand. The historical record is strangely quiet about what happened in the years immediately following the plague. There are no great monuments to the dead, no official days of mourning. It is as if the city collectively decided to forget, to bury the memory of the summer when their bodies were not their own. This silence is not the peace of recovery. It is the silence of fear. And this was not an isolated event. Smaller, less deadly dancing manias were reported in Germany, Holland, and Switzerland in the centuries before 1518. They were like tremors before the great earthquake, small tests by an unseen force, learning how human fear worked and how to use it as a weapon. Each outbreak was a rehearsal. Each one refined the method, teaching the malevolent consciousness how to better turn a community against itself. The curse learned from our ancestors' terror, adapting its methods until it was ready for the grand performance that would unfold on the streets of Strasbourg. The most terrifying truth is that we never found a cure because it was never a disease. The dancing simply stopped when the entity was full, when it had consumed enough life, enough despair, to be satisfied. It did not die. It went dormant, sinking back into the foundations of the city. Walk through Strasbourg today, on a quiet evening. Stand in the squares where hundreds danced themselves to death. You might feel it. A strange, rhythmic echo in the stones beneath your feet. A cold memory of a time when a curse claimed an entire city. And so, we are left with a chilling question that history cannot answer. If a curse of this power could be born from the poverty and despair of 1518, what new horrors might be sleeping, waiting to be awakened by the fears of our own modern world.